Hey friends, we are in week 8 of our book study on cultivating deeper connections in a lonely world. This is the Connected Mom podcast. However, for this season, we're doing a book club season. So I hope you've been able to join us for this special season. I hope that you're gathering with a group of friends and having great conversations, all built around how we can move beyond our loneliness by cultivating deeper connections in a lonely world. This week, we're going to talk about hospitality. Now, I have a question for you. What comes to mind when you think of the word hospitality? Do you think, Martha Stewart, China, great recipes? Do you think of Chip and Joanna Gaines and their perfect homes? Do you think of making a perfect meal and inviting people from work or from your church over for dinner? Well, according to the Bible, hospitality is really welcoming one another. In fact, the Apostle Peter says that we are to offer hospitality to one another without grumbling. And here's the thing, in the early church, hospitality was the norm. So in the early church, people would gather around tables for dinner in the evening, and it maybe wasn't perfect dinner. Maybe it was just you shared what you had with your neighbor, and together they would have conversations that would draw them deeper, both in their connections with each other, but also with God. And through the years, hospitality has changed. And I think for some of us here in the West Coast or in the Western Hemisphere, we think of hospitality as really having an extravagant dinner for extravagant guests and having, the perfect table settings of China, etc. But that's not really what the Apostle Peter had in mind. Hospitality is simply welcoming others. And we need to get back to this if we're going to have deeper connections in our world today. A few years ago, I came to the realization that often when women wanted to meet with me, I would say, well, let's go out for coffee. Now, to be fair, I still do that sometimes. I do love strong coffee, but I'm also learning that sometimes it's great to just say, sure, why don't you come into my home? I'll make some coffee and I'll be able to listen to you and we can pray together and get to know each other more effectively. And I have learned in the last few years that this is a great way to take my connections and make them deeper. Something happens when you're in your friend's home, even if that home is not perfect. Now, I know some of you are thinking, Becky, I've got small kids. There are toys all over the place. Hey, I like to think you really only need one clean room and, maybe a marginally clean bathroom to have a guest over to have coffee or to have a conversation or maybe coffee cake, or maybe you invite friends over and it's just a simple meal of pizza that you've ordered from a pizza parlor and some soft drinks, and you're just having a good time around the table. Throughout the New Testament, the table was a key element in hospitality. In fact, if you remember, Jesus invites us and extends his hospitality to us by welcoming us to his table, where he says, drink this and remember me. Eat my bread and eat my body and drink my blood to remember me. This is the body of Christ given for you. This is the blood of Christ shed for you. And so at the communion table, we experience the hospitality of Jesus. And so as I've been thinking about this and how necessary it is to bring it back to our churches and to us as believers, really, I think there are several key things to remember. First of all, hospitality is welcoming people. And it's not just welcoming your friends. In fact, Jesus said that when we throw a dinner party, we're to welcome the poor, the blind, the crippled, and the lame, people who often don't experience a welcoming attitude from others. And so what does this look like in your life and mine? I would encourage you to go out of your closest friend groups and certainly have them over, but then think about the neighbor who maybe doesn't have close friends or who is a shut-in or a widow. think about the coworker who just feels, to you like maybe they're a little bit of a recluse or they're lonely. Have them to your house. Invite them in for dinner or for dessert some evening and just say, hey, I want to have you over so I can get to know you better. Certainly start with your neighbors. Back in the day, people got together in each other's homes in neighborhoods all the time. And somehow in our busy 20th century, 21st century lives, we have gotten too busy to have other people in our homes. But when you invite them into your home, they get to know you more effectively and you get to know them more effectively. Another idea for you is if you cook like maybe one big meal a week. For me, this is usually Sunday dinner. We invite our grown kids and our grandkids to come for Sunday dinner, and most of them are able to come. And because I make a big dinner on that particular day, I know when I'm going to have enough food and I can invite other people into that dinner setting. And so sometimes my husband and I have invited another couple to join us or another family to join us because I know I have enough meat made and side dishes and salads and desserts, and maybe the desserts aren't really bakery worthy. They're just maybe ice cream with toppings. That's a great dessert to give when you have little kids around. And so by having one big meal a week, I know that if I want to invite somebody in for that, I can. And then, as I mentioned, inviting people into your home for coffee or tea. Years ago, Steve and I were living in the country of Sudan, East Africa. And in Middle Eastern culture in Sudan, if somebody knocked on your door, you never left them at the door. That was considered rude. So you always invited them in. And I remember that this was a little bit of a battle for me because at the time I had a toddler who would, leave toys all over the house. And I remember thinking, I kind of want to leave them at the door and scramble around and clean up my house. But that wasn't what was important in that culture. What was important in that culture was that they experienced a welcoming from me, that I would welcome them into my home, that I would offer them a cup of tea or a cup of coffee or whatever I had and listen to what they had to say and maybe share some thoughts. Maybe if the setting was correct, I would pray with them and then they would be on their way. And that was enough. I didn't have to have some fancy dessert and I certainly didn't have to have a perfect home. I met a woman a bunch of years ago now, and her name was Melody. I actually write about her in the book. And she talked about moving to a new part of the country and feeling so lonely. And she went to a Bible study, which is a great first step to get to know people at a church. And she said that the women in that Bible study offered her hospitality. They welcomed her into their group and they started getting to know her and inviting her whenever they went out to lunch together. That's another form of hospitality. Hospitality is just extending a welcome to another person. As I look around our world today, I see a lot of lonely people and I see people who are just hoping that somebody will welcome them. I think about several of my adult kids who started hosting big table dinners about 5 or 6 years ago. And they decided that what they would do with these big table dinners is they would set up a big table, obviously, have lots of chairs, and they would just make lots of food. And they would invite people from church, from their kids' sports teams, from people they knew from work, and they would just mix them all together and see what happened. And so many people who came that maybe were not from the church world said to them, we have never experienced anything like this. And all that led me to believe that it is the church. It is those of us who are believers who need to be paving the way in hospitality. We need to be the ones showing the world what it looks like to offer a welcoming stance. As I think about that, I think sometimes the church is known more for what we're against than for how welcoming we are. as food for thought, I would encourage you, if you're in a group, discuss this in a group. If you're doing this study on your own, think about how you could welcome others into your home this next week. Maybe for you, that means you're just going to invite somebody over for coffee. Maybe for you, it means you're going to throw a pizza party for a few of your neighbors. Maybe for you, it means you're going to invite some of the parents from your kids' sports teams over for dessert one night or for a pancake breakfast. Really, the sky's the limit. I remember when Steve and I were pastoring a church not too far from here up in Denver, and the county came to the church and said, could you teach your church members to be good neighbors? And we thought, well, this is kind of a no-brainer because Jesus says that we're to love our neighbors as ourselves. And so we offered our church people $100 if they would host a block party. And the results were phenomenal. People took that challenge literally. Yes, they took the $100, they bought a bunch of food, they set up grills outside, and they invited their neighbors and the people on their blocks over to a barbecue. And as a result, people in our church began to know their neighbors. Here's the question I want to leave you with. How can we possibly share the love of Christ if we're not willing to share our homes and our food? How can we point people to the love of Christ if we don't truly invite them in and welcome them as Jesus does? Here's the thing. At Jesus' table, there's room for everyone. The question is there room for people at your table? I hope you've enjoyed this short video, and I hope as a group that you're going to talk about how you can encourage one another to begin to practice hospitality. Peter said, offer hospitality to one another without grumbling. So let's give it a shot this week. Why not invite somebody over to your home? Change your life. Thanks for joining me today.